Hello, friends. Ralph Bristol at your service, and welcome to podcast number 3 for Tuesday, January 30, 2018. In today's podcast, will artificial intelligence replace most jobs and create a society of a few super rich and the rest of us dependent on them? Yes, if you can believe the talking heads on CNBC. The Heritage Foundation's Michael Sargent calculates the odds of the feds investing in Mayor Megan Barry's transit scheme or dream or plan. And on a personal note, how scary is it to sign up for Medicare and Social Security? And are there any shortcuts I should know about? Recently retired minds want to know. You know what would make a really good podcast? Mariana asked me last evening while I was a captive audience in the kitchen, making sure the steak I was grilling on the stove was cooked just right. Naturally, I could only listen with half my brain since the other half was doing something more important than calculating the odds that anyone who doesn't have Bill Gates' IQ can ever be anything more than a dependent on government in the not-too-distant future. But I'm pretty sure that's what I heard, and I do think it's an area worth exploring, not one I was naturally inclined to explore in retirement, but it is something I've discussed more than once with a gang of 4 on the radio, and it is naturally scary to wonder what people who make money with their education will do when a significant part of the value of that education is replaced by artificial intelligence. That'll be much more intelligent than the most intelligent human, and it'll not be hampered with emotional anchors that prevent the most logical decisions and actions. I personally think that artificial intelligence will both create and solve the problem. If artificial intelligence is all it's cracked up to be, it'll know how to solve the problem it creates and answer the question, how can humans best use the talents they have and live as independently as possible on the value they create for others? Now, page 2 of Off Track. What's wrong with Nashville's transit plan, and what should we do instead? Michael Sargent leads the Heritage Foundation's efforts to formulate and implement free market transportation and infrastructure policies. His research analyzes the federal role in funding and overseeing the nation's transportation infrastructure. Maybe it's his research that has convinced the federal government, finally, that funding light rail like this is not such a good idea, and they pretty much let Mayor Barry know that they are not likely to be a partner in her adventures. Sargent started with a flood of statistics about the annual federal budget, $4 trillion, the domestic part of that budget, 8%, how much of that 8% goes to infrastructure, $100 billion, how much of that goes to mass transit, $12 to $15 billion, and it comes from 2 sources, a formula grant for urban areas based on the size of the city mainly, and capital investment grants, which are authorized by Congress every year and are discretionary based on the desires of the administration and the holders of congressional purse strings. Based on the formula that Sargent mentioned and current spending levels, Nashville's share of the formula grant would be a tiny part of the overall cost of the project.
Those places, the major cities where you would pretty much expect, those get the greatest share of these formula dollars. When you look at medium-sized cities like Nashville, cities 200,000 to a million people, out of that $5 billion, those medium cities are only apportioned $950 million. So then when you get down to it and you look at Nashville's share, it's only $225.5 million per year out of that $5 billion. And that does account...
22.5.
Yeah.
It says 22. You said 220.
Oh, sorry, 22.5. Sorry about that. Out of that $5 billion. So it's relatively small share that takes into account the growth of the city. There is a trigger. If a city is growing really quickly, then it gets more money. That's including that.
If my math is right, and I think it is, that comes to 0.4% of Mayor Barry's projected $5.4 billion capital cost, and even that might be over-optimistic.
Also importantly, in the administration's budget for this fiscal year, they assume that the Highway Trust Fund spending conforms with revenues. That's an issue. Most people would budget like that, but that's an issue because Congress spends $15 to $25 billion out of the Highway Trust Fund, more than it takes in gas taxes. And so come 2021, they're going to run out of the cash they injected it with. And so the administration assumes that spending falls to revenues. That amounts to a 50% effective cut for transit programs. So that dollar figure could cut in half to $11 million unless Congress figures something out.
That's because the Trump administration has signaled a cut in transit funding, which would seem to exclude Nashville.
And that's really important because this administration is taking a completely different tack when it comes to the capital investment grant program. In their budget for this fiscal year, they cut the program and said, we're not going to accept any new applications for new capital investment grant programs. We are only going to allocate funding for existing projects that already have a full funding grant agreement with the federal government.
And Sargent is doubtful that Congress is going to resist the cuts in transit spending because of the condition of the budget. $666 billion deficit this year, projected to rise to $1 trillion again in the next 5 years.
What about Congress? They're the ones that have to sign off on everything. They're generally cool to the Trump administration's infrastructure proposal and not really in any mood to cut transit funding. But that said, I would expect the House Republicans' budget to come out largely in sync with the administration. We saw this last year. This would include cuts to the capital investment grant program. And this is both from a acknowledgement in the Republican caucus that some of these programs are really wasteful, but then also because of that pressure on the discretionary budget that I talked about.
Without the federal funding that Mayor Berry expects, the project will fall far short of the total funding she expects, and then it would most likely have to be slowed, pared down, or find more local funding. Stay tuned tomorrow as we continue to explore some of the reasons Mayor Berry's transit plan may be off track and some better ideas for easing Nashville's morning commute. Just in case anyone's interested, Mariana and I will be celebrating our 9th year of marriage on February 9. I realize this is not a very impressive number, but that's not the intention of this. I say that only because that's something we probably should have known before we visited Pete Benson of Beacon Capital Management to see how best to organize my new financial life, which will include signing up for Social Security after contributing to it for 51 years, among other things. Pete asked how long we'd been married, and our guesses range from 8 to 9 years. I was closer. Mariana and I have been a couple for 21 years, which is more important than how long or what date we finally tied the knot. But Social Security wants to know, so I'll probably remember that from now on. I am not, however, looking forward to the process of signing up for Social Security and Medicare. It's not that it makes me feel old. I don't mind that. It's all the paperwork, the phone calls, the meetings, and all of that stuff. If anyone has any tips they'd like to offer, just leave them in the comment section. And for now, until tomorrow, I'm Ralph Bristol, at your service, and that's podcast number 3.